Hello. First of all, so we will speak about, as my presentation is part of this conference called Wie Deutsch ist Yiddish, I would first of all say that if Yiddish were exactly the same as Deutsch, as German, my name would be Beider, but my name is Beider. And also, during my presentation, that will be unfortunately in English, not in German, linguists who are present in this conference can also take advantage of my presentation to study wie Russisch ist Englisch in Frankreich. We will speak about, so there will be four topics. First of all, very short ideology versus science, then a global comparison between German and Yiddish, a few words about some specific language systems, and reasons for divergence between Yiddish and German. Many things that I will present today they actually are present already. They were published already in my book in 2015 by Oxford University Press, Origin of Yiddish Dialects. But I would like to thank the organizer of this conference to invite me. And so it was a possibility to rethink some elements. So what I will present, it will not be just the summary of what I have published 6 years ago. There will be some elements which were not present in my book. So the first topic is the name of this conference legitimate? Normally for us it is, because the conference, we are all present on this conference. But before addressing this question, just a reminder for people who are not specialized in the history of Yiddish about two schools that existed and still exist actually in Yiddish studies. So the first school, that can be called conventionally Germanistic, it focuses on Yiddish differences in comparison to German. And the postulate for this school is that at some time, once in the past, there was a period when Jews in German-speaking countries were speaking a kind of pure German, but of course for some lexical elements which were present. And another school, which is younger, but now it is old enough, almost 1 century, and I call this school Jewish-oriented. It focused on Yiddish as a unique linguistic structure, and the most important and most theoretical representative of this school, Max Weinreich. So this school considered that Jews never spoke pure German, and Max Weinreich, who was the most important theoretist of this school, wrote in his book that all Jewish languages, including Yiddish, must be studied from inside, so from the internal history of the language. The emphasis is mine, must. I will show you an extreme case of that ask whether the name of our conference is legitimate. The books by Gerald Frakes, 1989, he calls this same school that I call Germanistic and Jewish-oriented, he called them anti-Jewish assimilationist and Yiddish nationalist. And then the whole book actually is an attempt to find, to reveal what is the ideology behind both of this school, of people who are working in the, following the corresponding paradigms. And he says explicitly that the basis for assimilanist, so for me, Germanistic school, is basic non-Jewish anti-Semitism, or, if the authors are Jewish, Jewish self-hatred. So I think if we would agree with these words, this conference should not hold place unless we accept these humiliating labels. But of course, this is a totally extreme case. But another linguist who wrote an excellent book in 2005 concerning the grammar of modern Yiddish, Neil Jacobs, he calls the same two schools divergence approach, divergence, so Yiddish as diversion from German, a convergence approach. He also adds that the underlying ideology for the divergence approach is the minority language were marginalized during the period when this school came to life. He also, in a footnote, adds that some German scholars who were members of this school had strong pro-Nazi sympathies, and that some today's scholars make errors which betray their fundamental misunderstanding of the basis of Yiddish. And of course, the only view accepted in modern Yiddish linguistics is the convergence approach, what I call Jewish oriented. Everything which is written by Jacobs is actually factual. This is true, but these facts are just some facts. Of course, we can find some representative of Germanistic school who had no pro-Nazi sympathies. Or, of course, we can also find in works by representative of the convergence or Jewish-oriented school errors, as it is normal for any scholarly studies. So the selection of this the words in this part, which actually is marginal for Jacobs and his book, because his book is focused on modern grammar, and as I said, it is an excellent exposure of this part. Just betrays some ideology which is underlying this evaluation. So we are facing a question, ideology versus science. So, of course, for every ideology, the main questions to be answered are what is good and what is bad according to some values. And for science, the questions are totally, the dichotomy is totally different, what is true, what is false. And actually, we cannot, of course, speak about science without introducing, however, what is good for science. And these principles, classical critical approach, trying to avoid ideological pitfalls, and search corroboration for advanced hypotheses in early text. This is crucial because without this studying early text written by Jews, every concept would be just speculative. Unfortunately, during the last 40 years, there were many studies done in Germany, primarily in the Trier University, that allow it to do this comparison being based on early Ashkenazic texts. And combine results of various schools if we find that they correspond to something which looks to be true, at least most logically plausible. And being based on that, on all of that, I would say I just reword the sentence by Max Weinreich that for me, all Jewish languages can be studied, can be reviewed both from inside and both from outside, and also from outside as well, of course. Second topic is global comparison between Yiddish, and German. I will start with just historical elements which are known to people who studied Yiddish history, but as here again, there are people who are coming from different domains. I would like just quickly to remind some basic elements of the approach of what is Yiddish, that is found in different historical literatures. So for native speakers, if we look in Jewish texts which are written in Ashkenazic vernacular, we find that in the 16th century, Western Europe, the word for this language is deutsch. During the next 3 centuries in both Western and Eastern Europe, the word is rather deutsch. So in both cases, of course, it's the same, it's a word cognate to Deutsch. And also in 18th, 19th century, we find Yiddish, Deutsch, etc. So for people who were writing in these languages, the language was considered a kind of German. And in Hebrew texts, we find an ambiguous term, Loshen Ashkenaz, so the language of Ashkenaz, and Ashkenaz is German-speaking territories. It is ambiguous, but we have an ambiguous elements which shows that it was considered by these authors as also a kind of German, because we find a document from the 15th century when a Christian state officially speaking in Loshen Ashkenaz, and also the emperor of Holy Roman Empire also spoke Loshen Ashkenaz, so I think it was not Yiddish. Next, this is the pre-scholarly time, and so German Christian authors who often Hebraists who were belonging to the school of humanism, usually for these people, you see here some quotes from Shadows, German with some what corrupted Buxdorf, similar words like German, for Buxdorf, he writes explicitly that the language spoken by and written by Jews of Germany of his time is German written in Hebrew characters. And since the end of 17th century, there is several terms that appear that could be translated to English as Judeo-German, like Jiddisch, Deutsch, Jiddisch, and Hebräisch, Deutsch. And for all these people, Yiddish was considered as a kind of corrupted German. So if we presented their understanding, which is, again, it was pre-scholarly time, the science of linguistics was not existent yet, and so the consideration was, for the history of German, was mainly based on the development of German standard literary language. And so we were ignoring, these authors were not realizing, overlooking the aspects corresponding to dialects. And so for them, there was Old German. Then Modern German is a direct descendant, the only normal child of Old German. And then there is a kind of bastard, so it came also from Old German, but being influenced and more corrupted, disturbed, mutilated, etc., by because of the influence of Hebrew, of Slavic languages, it became Yiddish. So this approach, I call it a naive approach to the history of languages, generally speaking, and here for history of Yiddish. And what was the merit of Germanistic school and such authors like Lazar Shanyan, Alfred Landau, and Edward Sapir, is to identify that and propose, instead of this naive approach, the scheme when the parent language is Middle High German, and not Middle High German literary language of the Hohenstaufen court of high poetry, but the language which exists as a set of dialects, so Middle High German dialects, that became the basis for two daughter languages, New High German dialects and Yiddish. So like that, modern German, New High German, and Yiddish are sister languages, having the same parent. And one of the last representative of this school, Yehiel Fischer, who later his book was published under the new Hebraized name Bin Nun. When he published his book in the first part of his study in 1935 in Germany, he was the first one to suggest that different Yiddish dialects, Western Yiddish and Eastern languages, Eastern Yiddish, they came from two different German, Middle High German dialects. He suggested Bavarian for Western Yiddish and East Central German for Eastern Yiddish. For Jewish-oriented school, the picture was totally different. And so here I present the picture, the scheme by Weinreich, Max Weinreich. There were three sources, so three components, Middle High German dialects, Judeo-Romans, and Hebrew and Aramaic, and all of them created after the process of selectivity from these three components, there was a new language that appeared, and it appeared almost immediately after Jews came, so migrated to German-speaking areas, and this was already Proto-Yiddish, the ancestor of all Yiddish dialects, and for Weinreich and for other representatives of his school, it is a fusion language from the beginning. So it's not a sister language for New High German, it's a separate language from the beginning. Because the Jews never spoke, according to the, Max Weinreich, a kind of pure German. So this Proto-Yiddish later gave rise to Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish. What is my suggestion? So my suggestion is to combine these two approaches, because I find that both schools created very important, made very important contribution, but they spoke partly about different stages of the development of Yiddish. So the beginning comes from the ideas of a Jewish-oriented school. So, of course, there was a period when Jews who came to Germany, they were speaking another language. And so there was a period, we can call it transition period, during which new migrants who came from Roman countries, and so their vernacular was a special Jewish register, we can also call it regiolect or ethnolect. The term is not really important. What is important, but it is not a separate language, because it had no structural difference in comparison to the language spoken by the Christian majority. At least until now, no source shows that there was at least one structural difference. So for me, they were speaking not just general Old Romance dialects, but the dialect was based on Old French. I have not found any Italian influence. And after this transitional period, Jews switched or shifted to a new language. And so the new language was, because this shift take place during the period when, according to German linguists, there was change from Old German to Middle German, so we cannot tell which one of them, but it's not really important. What is really important is that it was the same language after the end of this transitional period as the one spoken by Christian majority, except, of course, of some specifically Jewish repertoire, and that came from the language these Jews spoke before. So in this specifically Jewish repertoire, there were words of Old French origin, there were words of Hebrew origin, of Aramaic origin, and even since this transitional period could last several generations, even during this period, there were possibility of some new borrowing by Jews of Hebrew and Aramaic words into their vernacular. And of course, there was also a special Christian repertoire that was not included in the language of Jews, and speaking only about lexicon. So in both this repertoire, were just lexical elements, but the main part, structural part of the language for both Jews and German Christians was the same. And this period of joint life, if we can call it like that, lasted several centuries. And during these centuries, the volume of the Jewish repertoire was growing. And at some moment, there were not only lexical differences, but even structural differences. And from that moment, we can speak about branching of the one common language into two different idioms, one specific to Jews and another spoken by German Christians. So like that, at the end of the scheme, I'm totally joining the approach by a Germanistic school. From that moment, the development of these two languages was separate. Of course, there were still some influences between them, what is called adstratum, but this were already borrowing of one language from another, but not the legacy of the previous language spoken by ancestors. Excuse me, what is really one element which may be not so important, but still, if you see that in my scheme, the branching start at the period, it's not starting from Middle High German, but from early New High German dialects. It's not just on one side, one can say that it is just a terminology, but actually not. It's more than terminology because it corresponds to exact time frame. Just a reminder for classical approach in Germanistics, distinction between different periods of the history of High German language. And so early New High German, it's these are the dialects spoken mainly from mid-14th century until mid-17th century. So my assertion that branching was starting from, not from Mittelhochdeutsch, but from early New High German correspond to what is the period when it came to place. And so the period is after the mid of 14th century. And so why I say that the source was early New High German and not Middle High German? Because the formal distinction in Germanistics between what is Mittelhochdeutsch and what is early New High German, so frühe Neuhochdeutsch, it corresponds to three phonological criteria. Diphthongization of the former Middle High German long monophthongs, monophthongization of the former Middle High German diphthongs, and lengthening of short vowels in open syllables. And actually, in all known Yiddish dialects, we have this feature. So, and when we study the words of Yiddish which are of Slavic origin, we find that we don't observe, for example, the lengthening of short vowels. So that means that when Yiddish became separate from the structural point of view from German dialects, this rule of lengthening was not operational anymore. And so Yiddish really inherited this, all this phonological development from German. So from early, so it was during the early New High German period that the separation between Yiddish and High German dialects took place. And example, here you see Weiss, Teub with correspond of the diphthongization, Brief and Bloom example of monophthongization in Yiddish, and for lengthening, Beugen, that clearly reveals that the previous form was Bogen with a long O, and Raid, the previous form was Raid, Red with a long A. Not the short one as the Middle High German forms. And then after this branching, this separation, of course, there were still influences, and there was still borrowing from one language to another. Of course, the influence of German was stronger on Yiddish than the opposite, in the opposite direction. But here there were several processes that are worth being mentioned. First of all, when Jews came from Central Europe to Eastern Europe and to the territory of Polish kingdom at that period, and it lasted up to the beginning of 16th century, in many cities and even many villages of southern and western Poland, the main language was German, not Polish yet. Because it was spoken by German colonists who came to these areas. And so this colonial Silesian subdialect of East Central German had some influence on Yiddish, but it was not the basic dialect, because if we look to the language of this spoken, for example, in Lemberg or Krakow, so Lwów, Krakow, we see that this language spoken, Silesian dialect of German, was not the same as the ancestor of Yiddish. But it had some influence. And actually it, in some sense, allowed maybe Yiddish to survive in the Slavic environment, because the environment was not so Slavic. There were many German speakers around. Then in Eastern Yiddish during the 19th century, of course, there were influence of standard literary German, and some number of so-called Deutsch merisms came to Yiddish, but for that there is a special presentation by Stefan Krog tomorrow. And for Western Yiddish, it's different, because Western Yiddish continued to be, to develop in the environment in which Christian majority was German speaking. So a few words concerning specific language system. First, lexicon. So we find, after the analysis of different lexical features, that there is enormous overlap between Yiddish and German. And the older are the texts, the higher is the overlap. And we find what is really important, that both German and Yiddish share the same basic vocabulary. So preposition, articles, conjunctions, pronouns, body parts, family members, they are coming, they are close enough and they have the same ancestors. And maybe most important is, and there is also a good geographic correlation between Yiddish and German, in the sense that Western Yiddish often has, if there is a word that has a distant distribution, geographic distribution in German, so for example, in Western Germany, let's say Metzger, and in Eastern Germany, Fleischer. So we find always that Eastern Yiddish is goes with the German of Eastern Germany, and Western Yiddish usually goes with the Western. But from the very beginning, Yiddish was different on the lexical level. And we find specific Hebrew and Romance words which actually correspond, as I said, to the substratum, so they were inherited from the language of old French speakers who came to Germany. And there is a certain geographic discrepancy. So we find some words with Western German features in Eastern Yiddish as well. But actually, as it was analyzed by Erika Thiem, all these words correspond to the Ivritaic tradition, so the tradition of biblical translation. And so via this biblical translation tradition, these words, because biblical translation were studied in Cheder, so Jewish elementary schools, children were learning the language of this tradition, and so we were acquiring these words from the biblical tradition that came from west to east. There are some Jewish neologisms, of course. Some of them came from Ivritaic, so it's like translation from Hebrew to vernacular. But others appeared in Western Germany, and then they were brought to Eastern Europe by itinerant rabbis. And there are, of course, numerous German words which are known in Yiddish, so it's kind of selectivity in Weinreich term, but the non-selected words, if we study the old sources from 14th century, 15th century, we find them in Jewish texts, which are written in Hebrew characters, so they're not written for Christians, they're written for Jews. So for me, I cannot observe from the old Ashkenazic literature a clear case of huge process of selectivity. Many words were selected, so they were borrowed, but then they just were abandoned. And most important, lexicon is just surface level for any language, except for basic vocabulary, but basic vocabulary is shared. One about morphology, a large overlap again. There is a good correlation with German original morphemes, and no divergence in medieval text on this level. And for Western and Eastern Yiddish, we see that from the morphological point of view, these sources were not the same High German dialects. Of course, we find also some cases of divergence, but they are found only at the end of the Middle Ages, and actually, again, as shown by Erika Thiem, they correspond to German suffixes and affixes that are were introduced via the Ivritaic biblical translation tradition. And the use of Hebrew and Slavic suffixes, it's clearly an innovation. We don't find such elements in the older text, and numerous hybrid words again. So there is no evidence in medieval documents about any fusion phenomena that would be present from the beginning of the Jewish presence in Germany. Phonology, just a few words. Here, this is phonology. I studied in detail because this is usually the domain that allows to distinguish dialects. And in Germanistic, it's the main approach is all the different isoglosses were based mainly on phonology. So it's clear that in both Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish, they developed in unique systems of stressed vowels, but this appeared to be an innovation because when we look into the old texts, we don't find any divergence. The text from Alsace, they correspond to the phonological behavior of local German. The text from the Rhine area correspond to that of Rheinfelsisch, etc., etc. So this is clearly an innovation. And the basis, again, for Western and Eastern Yiddish were not the same dialects. So for Western Yiddish, mainly East Franconian, and for Eastern Yiddish, it's mainly Bohemian colonial dialect that was later influenced by Silesian. Last thing, how to explain the difference between idioms having the same ancestor as Yiddish and German, so two sister languages having the same ancestor. But the problem here is also that they are sister languages, but the mother has the same name as one of the daughters. So the mother is called German, and the two daughters, one is Yiddish and another is German. So this terminological issue clearly influenced the understanding of what is Yiddish, and it clearly was one of the main points that influenced the naive approach to history of Yiddish. Religion, of course, it is important, and so this is because of that there was a how it from where comes the influence. The culture, languages related to religion were not the same for Jews and Christians, and so this is why we for Jews we find in Yiddish so many Hebrew and some number of Aramaic words, and even later even suffixes of Hebrew and even Aramaic origin as well. And for German, of course, the language of religion and culture was Latin. So here there was a first source of diversion. For diversions. Another one is biblical translations, and because they were important for the development of both Yiddish and German, and I told a lot about Ivritaic tradition, but of course for German, the development of German, it's well known which way the translation of the Bible by Martin Luther was important for the development of literary German. There was not only religious literature tradition which were separate, but non-religious was also separate, of course, and it influenced the development of the standard language. Then independent linguistic fashion phenomena. What I mean by that? It's in every language, a living language, it has a tendency of developing, so changing. Otherwise, it would be a dead language. And so these changes, they came usually from one milieu, and then when people are imitating the behavior of some members of the same milieu, and then from it comes around. So people have the tendency of imitating their elite, so their leaders, And then this one is a major element for the development of every dialect or every language. And the elite were not the same for Jews and non-Jews, of course. So people were imitating not the same persons. And last but not least, maybe the most important, physical separation. Of course, physical separation of Jews and Christians was crucial for the development of Yiddish. And in Western area, there were in Western, it was the anti-Jewish legislation that created ghettos in some large places, and also mass expulsions from different German cities and even the whole provinces in the 15th century. And for Eastern Yiddish, of course, it was a migration to the Slavic area that was an extremely important factor for the divergence between Eastern Yiddish and its parent Bohemian dialect, colonial dialect of German. Thank you for your attention.